Hello and welcome to the OTB channel. Well, today I'm going to do a video that I admit I've been putting off for quite a while. Systemd, the init system that seems to have taken over most of the major distributions over the last few years. It's still a topic of hot debate, and so today we're going to have a look at what all the fuss is about. See you after the intro. Right, welcome back. So, Systemd. This is a subject that has been on my list of videos to cover for the best part of the last year. And I've shied away from it for a couple of reasons. The first reason is it seems to be still a really hot topic. It's quite political, and there are those for it and those who are against it, and at either extreme the debates are quite fierce, to the extent that there really is no way to win the argument, so to speak, by producing a video on the debate. What's even more noticeable about the Systemd debate is that it does seem to exist at the extremes between its supporters and its detractors. And certainly in the desktop Linux world, there's this huge grey area where probably more than 90% of desktop users don't really know a great deal about it, and if truth be known, probably care even less, as long as their system boots up and it's stable and it works correctly. So I've probably been in that big grey area, and one of the things that was putting me off looking at the Systemd debate was it meant that I had to go and read. I had to go and read articles, Reddit posts, anything else I could find on the internet to get a firm grasp on it, because it seems to be a really technical debate about the merits of other init systems as compared to Systemd. So I've done that. I've gone off and read what's out there. And in truth, I have to say that I'm really none the wiser, or perhaps wiser in terms of the pros and cons. But where do I stand in terms of, do I fit into a particular camp? And I have to say that, no, I really don't, I don't think. I can understand the arguments on either side. I can also see that for every argument that's put forward, there seems to be a counter-argument, which also makes sense. And I think I'm probably still in that big grey area where I think, well, I don't do a huge amount with my init system. As long as my system is stable, how does it actually affect me? And I haven't really got a clear answer to that question. I run Arch, as most of you know, which is Systemd. But I've also, for the last month or so, been running Void Linux, which is not Systemd. It's Runit. What difference have I noticed in terms of the functionality of both systems? Nothing of note, really. Both run fine. Both do what they're meant to do. Is one faster than the other? I can't honestly say, other than timing it, that it's been a noticeable difference. But I thought it would be worth just reviewing what's been said and almost take the stance of a neutral observer just to present some of the arguments in as non-technical a way as possible so that you can see what's been firing people up. So let's start by looking at this whole thing about what is an init system. So let's just go to the combined screen and start with what is an init system in the first place. Well, init is short for initialization, which pretty much describes everything you need to know. It's the first process that's started by the kernel when the computer boots. and the init system goes on to start all the other services that are required. And if the kernel is unable to start the init system, this is when you get a kernel panic. Now, traditionally, and I say traditionally, what I'm referring to here is a previous init system known as SysVinit or System 5 init. Init was responsible for starting all the services that the computer needed and making sure that they did start for each run level. And run levels were an important concept with the traditional init system. And in this way, it ensured that the user environment was correctly configured and functional, dependent upon what run level the computer was in. Now, all run levels meant it was a particular state for the machine. So it could be in single user mode, multi-user mode, or it could be moving on to reboot or halt. And depending upon what run level the system was in, well, that would dictate what scripts or services the init system started up. All these were defined in a file called etc initab, and in order to change the run level, all the user had to do was open a terminal or a TTY and type tellinit3 or tellinit5. Nice and simple. And it worked. It was a really simple system. So what was the problem? Well, I'm not sure there was a problem as such, more than as much as a growing awareness that actually it could be a little bit more efficient. The problem with SysVinit was it started tasks serially, in other words, one after the other. So each service would have a startup script, and the init system would start them up in a particular order. What this meant was that you had to wait for each script to run in order for the boot process to be finished. So it could result in boot delays, although there were all sorts of optimizations that sped up the process anyway. So I can't say when I was running systems on SysVinit that I noticed huge delays, but hey, this is one of the big things. Also, as time has gone on and Linux has developed, systems themselves have become more complex. The init system, SysVinit, didn't become more complex, but the startup scripts to run the particular services did become more complex, and as a result, they became harder to understand. There was also no real ability to automatically deal with dependency handling. In other words, to start up a particular service only after networking was up and running. That would all have to be done manually and scripted in. And as a result, I mean, these seem to be minor things, but there seemed to be a general view that actually what we had could be improved. And we've seen many alternatives that all claim to be an improvement. I mean, I've listed a few there. Upstart, OpenRC, which you're probably familiar with as far as Gentoo is concerned. Runit, well, Void Linux runs Runit. S6, and of course, Systemd was one of the contenders there. We still have, of course, some distributions out there that are sticking to not moving to Systemd. They may well be using alternatives such as Void, which uses Runit. But actually, in the main nowadays, most of the major distributions have moved on to Systemd. So if you look at Red Hat and Fedora, all Systemd. You look at Ubuntu and Debian, all Systemd. SUSE Linux, all Systemd. So most of the main, and I use this advisedly, main distros out there have now moved on to Systemd, which has meant that actually our choices as users if we don't want to use systemd is actually quite restricted. There are still some distros out there that use other alternatives. There is the one from Debian, or was a fork of Debian called I can never pronounce this. Devian. There's Void Linux, of course, and then there's Slackware, which has never shown any sign of moving across. And in fact, that still uses its old BSD style in its system. But nevertheless, it's really fast. It seems to work. Yes, it's based on running scripts, but it hasn't yet moved to systemd. But if you want to use one of the main distros, the chances are at the moment that you are going to move across to systemd. Now, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Well, it depends on your point of view. So what is systemd, and why is it so contentious? Well, first of all, let's say it's a replacement init system. But it's much more than that. It's a service manager, and it's a whole suite of software applications that are all interlinked with each other. And it was developed by a couple of Red Hat developers, the most famous one being Lennart Pottering, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who I believe is a German developer, and Kay Sievers. And so it was Red Hat that gave us this thing called systemd. And the key thing right at the beginning is it aggressively launches services in parallel, so not one after the other. It launches them all at the same time, which results, not surprisingly, in faster boot times. And I suppose compared to when I used systems years ago, Linux has become hugely faster at booting, and I'm sure systemd has had something to do with that. But actually, it does so much more than that. It maintains mount and auto mount points. It supports snapshotting and restoring. It's got this dependency-based service control logic, so it understands if a particular service needs to be started before another service can be started up. It can be responsible for device management, login management. It can even be a replacement boot manager. I still use Grub, but you can boot a system directly with systemd if you wish to. I believe it works better with UEFI systems. I'm not entirely sure whether it works with legacy systems. And the systemd framework, or the applications that are bundled with systemd, also provide replacements for a whole range of traditional utilities, cron being one, which has been replaced potentially by the systemd timer system, and the new systemd journaling system, which has replaced the need for syslog, name resolution, you name it. There seems to be a systemd utility that can replace existing utilities. Now, on different systems, whether these things have actually replaced traditional utilities is going to be distro dependent. But you can already see that just taking a broad sweeping approach here, it is much more than just an init system. It's almost, once you start to read about it, like an operating system in its own right. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Well, here the debate begins. Now, reading through all the articles and Reddit posts, etc., it's very clear that some people love systemd, whilst others absolutely detest it. Those who love it seem to cite the same things over and over again. Always faster boot times. That seems to come right at the start of the list. But then you get reference to the fact that, this dependency handling, starting up services in a particular order that it can do automatically is a great thing. It also automatically handles mounting. It monitors started services. It can use socket activation, and it can even automatically restart services if they crash. So, yeah. And many people, or many of the sysadmins whose comments I read, said that actually they preferred it. It gave them a consistent way of managing multiple systems, that they found it easier because it was the same on whatever system they were on. A straightforward set of commands. It had greatly simplified the whole process, and they either loved it or they hated it. There were some who pointed out that they liked this bit of it, but didn't like that bit of it. But in the main, those people were saying that, look, it might just be a case of getting used to a new way of doing things, and didn't really want to come down on one side or the other. Ultimately, though, what Leonard Pottering describes systemd as is the glue between the kernel and the applications, between the kernel and the user space, if you like, and this one thing and its associated applications all interact to make sure that you get a consistent and stable experience. And that, no doubt, is why most of the major distros have now moved over to it. However, not everyone sees these advantages, if they even accept their advantages, as being worthwhile, given some of the problems. Now, before I talk about the disadvantages, let me just make a comment here. I found this personally one of the most difficult and hard to get a grasp on topics that I've actually read. Many of the points that are made are highly technical, and they often have an opposing argument that seems, equally feasible. So this video is not meant to be an exercise in highlighting every single point that's made by both sides. I just want to talk about some of the key points that came up again and again throughout my reading. And right at the top of the list seems to be this notion that systemd has departed from the Unix principle, where you have one thing that does one thing very well. Systemd, in contrast, tries to do multiple things and be all things to all people. So the problem is, if it goes wrong, there isn't just one thing that you have to worry about anymore about fixing. You've got something that has its claws wrapped around every part of the system. And in fact, I think that's it ultimately, that systemd isn't just an init system. It's involved in every aspect of modern Linux systems who are using it. They complain it's inflexible. It's way overcomplicated for what it needs to be. It's completely unnecessary to have something this big. It takes away user choice because it's not easily swapped out. And it's a monolithic monster. Now, whether or not it's monolithic depends on your point of view, because, in fact, it isn't a single entity. It does have lots of individual applications, but I will grant you they are all interrelated. So whether you see that as monolithic or not will depend on your viewpoint. But nevertheless, it's difficult to argue against the fact that it is wrapped around the whole system. Is it unnecessary? Well, you do sometimes wonder, does it need to handle such things as networking and name resolution? Weren't cron jobs fine as they were? Did we really need the systemd timer? What was wrong with the old system of looking at logs where we'd just, use cat and grep and put it together ourselves? And at least we were dealing with straightforward text files there rather than a binary log, which, if it goes wrong, if it gets corrupted, how do you actually go about fixing that? So all these concerns are there, plus a concern that as it's wrapping itself more tightly around the Linux system, it's becoming more and more difficult to port applications to other systems that don't use systemd, because we're seeing an increasing level of dependency on some component of systemd. And GNOME seems to figure quite large here, that GNOME has become really dependent on many aspects of systemd. Now, I know Gentoo basically says it's a dependency, or systemd is a dependency of GNOME. But from reading around, that's perhaps not quite as straightforward as it sounds. It will depend on the distro and how the distro is configured. But certainly, it's not just a straightforward case of porting it from one system to another. There's also the fact that systemd is very much geared towards Linux, so it won't work on BSD. So it's a Linux-only system, which seems to be creating multiple dependencies as it goes. So it's huge, it's overcomplicated, it's unnecessary, and there are concerns about what happens if with binary logs and how do you port it to other distros. And right at the bottom here, we also have a concern about the lead developer Leonard Pottering. There seems to be a worry that Leonard Pottering doesn't really take account of the community critiques of what he's been doing. And when they say, well, if you put it in this, it means that we won't be able to use that anymore. And it's a shrug of the shoulders, albeit a text-based shrug of the shoulders. And he's just carried on regardless on the basis of, I'm putting this in here and like it or lump it. So I've watched a few videos with Leonard Pottering talking, and I have to say that I haven't noticed that myself. But nevertheless, here at the heart, we have this big monolithic system that's just taking over the world, that is far more than it needs to be. Right. I can't tell you, people, how much reading I did about this. And I have to say that as a result of the reading, I think I became more confused about my position. There were, at some points, I was thinking, okay, I can see the advantages. Something needed to be done to improve the old SysVinit system. And yes, systemd offered a solution. At the same time, at the back of my head, I'm thinking to myself, but it's gone so much further than that. It's getting involved in this, that, and the other. And it's becoming huge. It's becoming a whole suite of applications. Does it actually need to be that? Couldn't we have just had the basic systemd system that replaced the old init system? Did we need everything else that went with it? I've come away thinking, well, I'm not one of these, super developers, and Leonard Pottering is. I mean, he was the guy responsible for Pulse Audio and Avahi, I believe, in Linux, and he's obviously a very skilled person. And the fact that the major distros have moved over to it makes me also think to myself, well, they obviously know more than I do. I'm just some old bloke who's a desktop Linux user. And I think as a desktop Linux user, ultimately, I don't think it really makes much difference. I don't think it's going to make a massive difference to me running my system. I think if it's going to make a difference, it's going to be with business critical servers. And I do see the issue there that because it's wrapped around everything, if something goes wrong, is it going to be as easy to fix? Maybe it is. Maybe I'm just not understanding that. But from what I've been reading, I do have some qualms about whether or not it should be used on server systems. But every article I read makes me think, well, perhaps not. And it does seem to be stable on the whole. And I have to say, it looks like it's here to stay. But so do the debates. And I title this video A Debate with No Ending. And really, it does seem to be that. So to conclude this, all I can say is The debates may still be ongoing, but to a large extent the battle seems to have been won, or at least the first stage of the battle. So that's all I want to say about Systemd, and we'll probably never to return to it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to join me on Library. And before we finish, I would just like to thank my patrons, premium member Corbinian Schilderman, and we've had a few other guys join us over the last few days. Aristoteles Papa Giorgio, Stormpix, Stephen Cross, Mike Long, David Bird, Entropy UK, Richard Wade and Ty Gare. Thank you guys. These are the people who are going to make this channel all that it can be. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in a day or two.